What should a philosopher contribute to environmental issues? What can philosophers in general contribute to anything? So what I will do and what philosophy very often is doing is in a sense reveal the complexity of an issue. Something is more complex than we know or we think. There are a lot of distinctions to make. There are perhaps mechanisms and ambiguities we are not aware of, and so philosophy is very often dealing with these type of things. And that's the approach of philosophy I will take today. So I will show how complex the problem is. I will not say that much about solutions. Personally, I also work on solutions, but today I will not say that much. I make some hints and I refer to some things, but I will not focus on it. So I will make you a bit depressed in a sense, how complex, how hard environmental issues are. Nonetheless, that should not be lead to a negative conclusion. So I have a lot of slides. I'm trained at the university, so I give traditional lectures. That takes too much time, but I feel free to ask questions. I have a kind of assignment to do afterwards, but we will need to see how that works. But also feel free during the lecture if you have a discussion. We don't have time for very long discussions, but if there is something you want to say, of course, feel free. So the nice thing is that I can start, so I can set, in a certain sense, the stage. So what is the problem we are worrying about, or what is the problem we're thinking about? So I will go very quickly through the first part. So we're worried about major environmental problems, like climate change is perhaps the most well-known, but we have also biodiversity loss, ocean acidification. You have several others, like problems with the nitrogen cycle, etc. Many of you, I suppose you know this type of figures. So this is the rise of carbon emissions through history. So this is 400,000 years ago, so there seems to be something special in the recent period. These are the predictions of temperature rise, sometimes 4 degrees. Doesn't sound like much, but if you look to climate zones, 4 degrees is really an enormous change. So there are also other problems, so I will focus mainly on climate change, but the mechanisms or the things I will tell you also apply to these other problems. So this is, for instance, an indicator, the Global Living Planet Index. I'm not very good in what it exactly means, but it is a kind of indicator how many species and how many animals there are. Just how many animals or something, how many nature beings there are in the world. So you see that just on 40 years there is a decrease of almost 1/3. So that's enormous, because we're talking about an evolution of millions of years, and just in this small period of 40 years. And for some type of species it is even more dramatic. So this is about freshwater species. This is about ocean acidification. So this is a very well-known figure nowadays, the last 5 to 10 years. I think it's less than 10 years ago. The planetary boundaries. So we understand more and more that sustainability is a multidimensional thing. So there are several problems, and we cannot say there is only one. It's natural capital. We better say there are different types of problems, and nature can take quite a lot of pressure, but there is a limit. There is a planetary boundary. That is this green zone. And you see in some zones we're really going over it. So that's climate change, biodiversity loss, and the nitrogen cycle. The first time I saw this figure, I thought, oh, luckily there are some zones we're doing very well, but it's just that there is no measurement of these problems. So that's just saying there is a problem, and I suppose you all are aware of it. And now I just want to try to understand why is it so difficult to deal with them. And in a sense, all these problems they have something simple, and I think the simple claim as such is true. So what do we need to do to deal with climate change? We just need to emit less carbon, and I think that's true. That's not open for discussion. We need to protect habitats, etc. So, but that, how I will understand it, there are kind of structural problems. Namely, the situation is structured or framed in such a way that they make us behave in a certain way. And there are several of these structural problems interacting with each other. So what Stephen Gardiner, the text I sent to you or was put on the website, I think that was a great idea of him. He uses this, this metaphor of a perfect moral storm. And so that refers to a certain book of Sebastian Junger, and there's also a movie about it. I haven't seen it, but I know the basic idea. So there's a kind of perfect storm because three types of storms happen at the same moment. And that makes it almost impossible to escape it. It's kind of the perfect storm. And so this is the perspective I will look at. This is the idea to approach climate change and the other issues. So here there is a quote from Stephen Gardiner, the one who wrote that book, and this chapter you saw. So there are forces on us that put us on a certain way, likely at least to throw us off the course and may even sink us into the bargain. Okay, so I start with the first structural problem, and who knows this idea of the tragedy of the commons? And who knows it really? If I would ask you to explain it, I will not ask you, so don't worry. Who would be able to say more or less what is the basic mechanism? Okay, that's less than I expected, but some of you know. And the other question is the prisoner's dilemma. Who is familiar with that? Who would be able to explain that more or less? Okay, that would be 30% of the group. So yeah, I thought to go really quickly over it, but I go a bit more slower than planned. So the tragedy of the commons is a famous article of Garrett Hardin in '68, and this is, if you do a course on environmental problems, this should be in it. It is one of the most classical textual problems with it, but it makes very clearly what very often is a problem. So it's very well expressed in this figure, which is not from Gardner. So you have a common land. So the example he is using is a meadow, a grass field used by herders, so sheepmen, people with sheep or cow. And so the grass is good for the cow. If you put more cows or sheep on the field, you have more income. And so everyone has an incentive to put more sheep, I will say sheep, to put more sheep on the meadow. But what happens if more and more animals are put on the meadow, the land will be overgrown, and so we will end up with the depleted resources, which is the tragedy of the commons. That's very basically the same. I have some nice pictures to show it to you again. You have a common land, there are a lot of resources, but everyone wants to maximize utility, because that's your personal logic. You want to have more income, or it should not be egoistic, it can be to feed your family or because it's necessary. And then in the end, we end, like Gardiner says, ruin to all. Sorry. And so the underlying mechanism there is what is known in the literature as the prisoner's dilemma. I think this is a very nice story, and if you don't know the prisoner's dilemma, you should look it up. I suppose there must be nice clips on YouTube or very easy texts that explain it. It's with a story and it explains. I will not look at the prisoner's dilemma. I give you immediately an environmental example, which is a bit, perhaps I should choose another example, but I think this basically gives the idea. So imagine the following situation. You're going for a picnic on the beach, and then you have two options. Either you take all the stuff you left with you, all your mess you made with you, you clean it up, or you leave the mess, you pollute, in a sense, the beach. And all the other people have the same two options. So the result will depend on the choices of both me and the others. So what would be optimal is that everyone takes their stuff with himself. Everyone cleans up, and we will put some numbers on it. This is what we call game theory. So game theory looks at the choices depending on choices of other people, interdependent choices. What would be worse is that everyone left their garbage. So that's what they call a punishment. That would be a negative situation. So we don't like that, because the next time I go to the beach it would be like a garbage belt. That doesn't sound like much fun. However, that's just from the collective perspective. So there are also possibilities that people act differently. So there is a kind of temptation. Namely, everyone takes their stuff with him and I leave my stuff. So I will have the clean beach in the future and I don't have to do anything for it. There's also a kind of fear. Namely that I take my stuff with me, but everyone leaves their stuff on the beach. So I will have a dirty beach in the future and I have done work for it. In game theoretic language, you're the sucker. Then you have a very negative utility. You've done a lot of work and have a bad result. And so then they put it in this, how do you say it, schedule. So I have two options. I can clean up or leave mess. And the other players, that's game theory, have the same two options. Either they clean up or they leave mess. So we know that the best for everyone is cleaning up. We also know that it's worse that everyone leaves mess. But so now the individual will think for himself, what should I do in this situation? And I'm hesitant a bit about the beach example because the effort is so small, but you can think about all the other situations, like should I take public transport to bring my children to school, or should I go by car? So that's exactly the same logic. But let's look at the beach again. So suppose I know that the other one will clean up. I think that, I have good reasons to think that. Then I have a good utility if I clean up. But of course it's a bit more interesting to leave mess, because then I have the clean beach without doing any effort. So if the others clean up, it might be more interesting for me to leave mess. But perhaps I think that the others will leave their stuff, will leave garbage on the beach. So what should I do? If I would clean up in that case, then again I'm the sucker. I will have done effort without having any good result. So it's better to leave my stuff as well. So in both situations, whatever the other person is choosing, it is for me more interesting to do nothing, to do not cooperate, as we say in game theoretic language. And that's what we call a dominant strategy. So the prisoner's dilemma is a bit special. It's really made, everything is made special to make a dominant strategy. Not all game theory has a dominant strategy. But here it's clear for that person what he should do. Assuming again that he wants to maximize utility, etc. That's more clear in the prisoner's dilemma because it's about prison sentences. And we can assume that people prefer a sentence of 1 year in jail above a sentence of 10 years in jail. So that's the logic we are confronted with. Yeah, I just showed this picture. It's the same idea. So there is a dominant strategy. And it's important that in all these type of problems there are two motives. There's always the temptation. Think about driving car versus public transport. If everyone would take public transport, then it's interesting for me to take a car because then there is no traffic jams, no congestion. In that case, I think, yeah, now it becomes interesting to take a car. And there's always a fear as well. Suppose that I'm being on public transport and it has a bad schedule, but all the others are going quickly through their job or to their school, and I'm here the one contributing while the others can benefit. And what's also important is it's not ignorance. It's not that people are not aware of environmental problems. Everyone knows that pollution of public transport is less than of cars. Everyone knows that leaving your stuff on the beach is worse than taking your stuff with you. So it concerns free, fully informed choices. And nonetheless, we choose very often the collectively bad outcome. So that is because the individual logic is different from the collective logic. And again, it should not be egoism. Again, it can be, for instance, to bring your sick aunt to the hospital. So, but then you can also use the polluting car. So it's two types of logic that are conflicting with each other. And so I mentioned already some of the examples. So this is what we call collective action problems. The screen doesn't follow what I'm doing. No, I have a problem. So there are other examples like car driving versus carbon. So he's saying something.
Connect to the base unit.
Yes, we have to connect it to the base unit. Please do that. Fishermen versus fish stocks. Also, for instance, another example is the use of antibiotics and resistant antibiotics. So it might be, I might think for my child, for certainty I give my child antibiotics. But that may lead, if you do that too much, to resistant antibiotics. I try it again, but I'm pretty sure it will not work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
I just continue for the moment. You might.
May I ask a small question?
Yes, of course.
You told it's not from an egocentric perspective, but is it more? Is it then self-interested, a little bit prudential, that you always want a good outcome for yourself, that you don't focus?
So it's self-interested, but the self does not necessarily lead to only you as a person, or it should not only be income. It often is a kind of, I'm concerned with my income or time, but like it can also be the family, or you work for an organization that does very good things or so. So it's, what is the main point is there are two logics conflicting with each other. And I mean, there are ways to go beyond this dilemma, but it's good to understand that there is a kind of conflict. Okay. Should we perhaps plug out and plug in something?
Yeah, I tried that. I'll check the device. I think it's connecting to this.
Yeah, the computer was already completely stressed by this IT. Yeah, I continue a bit. I hope that it will follow. So it's called the tragedy of the commons. But the tragedy has, in a sense, a double meaning. Tragedy, that's typical for philosophers, perhaps, to indicate what are double meanings. So if you say it was a tragic accident, that means that the outcome is bad. But here the tragedy refers to the old meaning of tragedy, like in Greek writing, namely that it's inevitable what the outcome will be. So this is a famous quote of Gardiner, namely, so this is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd, so his animals, he's a herdsman, without limit. And that in a world that is limited. And then comes the very strong sentence. Ruin is the destination towards which all men rush, each pursuing his own interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. So that's the tragedy of the commons and the idea of the prisoner's dilemma. So, but we're not always, not in every interaction we have a tragedy. So we need to understand when does this tragedy happen. And so there are two...
Sorry to interrupt you, but we'll just try to switch it back on because, sorry, I think it's easier.
Well, I just want to, or try to, because it's helpful to have my presentation in front of me. So there are economists say there are different types of goods. So a first type of goods is private goods, what they call private goods. So that's a lot of stuff we know, like bread or a chair or cars. And so they have two features. So it's very easy, if I buy a chair, it's all other consumers are excluded. So it's my chair, my bread. And it has a second feature. That means if I buy a chair or a bread or a car, then there are less cars and chairs in the shop. So that are the two typical, that sounds very normal, but that's not for all goods the case. So the opposite category are public goods. So typical examples of public goods are a lighthouse, army, dikes. Dikes are a very good example. So once you build a dike, it's accessible to everyone. And it's very difficult to exclude one. For instance, if someone enters the country, I cannot say, you're not protected by the dike, you have not paid for it. You're not. No, he is protected by the dike by principle, because the dike, if the sea is raising, it just protects everyone. And also what's interesting there, which is also different, if you add more consumers of dikes, for instance, if 10 million people would move extra to the Netherlands, the cost of the dikes would not be more. So that's what they call, I have some complex notions for that, non-rivalness, but so it stays the same. That's what is a really public good. And so what is relevant with regard to the tragedy is the non-excludability. So the commons are goods where it is very difficult to exclude people, biodiversity, climate, oceans. It's very difficult, fish stocks. It's almost impossible to exclude consumers for that. With fisheries, they try it, but it's very difficult to control the oceans or to see, to follow the, what do I...
Pointer, so you can just change it without
that's correct.
being in front of the computer.
Yeah, because I like to walk, so that's so this is the feature that allows free riding. But again, so there's free riding possible with regard to dikes, but we don't have a tragedy there. It's not that if we add 10 million people to the Netherlands, that the dikes collapse, perhaps if they all stand on it. But I mean, not in general, they will not. So there is something else, and this is what is called the commons or common pool resources. So they have this feature as well. It's difficult to exclude other consumers, but they have a second feature, namely the consumption of it, the use, also decreases the availability, the total amount of this. And it's very little. If I drive my car, I pollute very little the atmosphere, but if we do it all together, then it has a major impact. And that's different from dikes. It has no impact on the number of consumers. So it's the fact that it's difficult to exclude people, and it's depletable. And that's what makes it tragic in the first sense, that the resource will be depleted. So, like I said, I will not say that much about solutions, but I will always hint towards them. So one of the solutions is with regard to, the topic is land use, so this is a typical example from land use. So you have too much sheep, what you can do is privatization. You create a mark, you define this is what you can use and this is what you can use. But as you feel, you cannot do that for everything. You can do that for land, but not, for instance, for air or even fish stocks, because then you need to know where the fish are going, etc. The other option is that the government create rules or incentives to organize it. What is interesting about these two standard options, and also Harden is mentioning these, they have something in common. both market solutions and government solutions, they both rely on the need of an external actor. That might sound strange that a market relies on because that's just seen as an example of freedom, that they rely on something extra. But in order to have a market, you need a really strong government. Government needs to define property right, you need lawyers, you need contracts, you might need police. That are all conditions for a functioning market. You need a really strong government, or you need at least quite some government intervention. But the interesting thing, so Gardiner in his article, so he describes this grassland in the meadows and all the herders putting too much animal and the grassland gets destroyed. And the logic, I think, in a sense, he describes there is something right to it. But that's not what happened in history. All these villages and all these older societies, they had commons and there was no problem. So they were able to manage it. And what they often had is what they then call internal solution, and what's called the self-governance of the commons. So you might have heard about this name, Eleanor Ostrom, who won the first female winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics. So it appeared that people started to discuss with each other and say, how do they saw, of course, the problem, and they started to talk, which is not possible in the prisoner's dilemma, so that's why, or they imposed some rules. They said, for instance, the rich people could put more cows on, or everyone can have equal cows on the field. So, with regard to this type of problems, there did not be to be such a strong problem in history. There was a kind of self-governance of the commons. But now, and this is the type of thing I will. So that's one logic. You feel already that there is a logic that makes it a bit difficult, but there are other logics intervening with it if we talk about climate change. Because with regard to the grasslands, we don't have a big problem. But climate change is different, and other environmental problems. And the first difference is what we call, sorry for all these complex words, but we at the university, is cost distribution. So what's very typical of the fishermen, the small fishermen community, the herders community, is that those, and also with congestion and traffic, is that those creating the problem are also those suffering from the problem. So if you're driving a car, you're creating a problem, but they're also suffering. So you think the whole time they should do something about it, because you're experienced. But a lot of environmental problems are not like that. You have a factory, a river, and a village. The factory pollutes the river, and the village suffers. So there, the factory has no incentive, or the other country or whatever, has no incentive to work on it. If you're in a real common problem, like the historical cases, like with the meadows and the grasslands, the local fisheries, people had an incentive. They said, yeah, we need to talk about this, we see that. So if you have cost distribution, then there is no incentive from within the group. And so it's difficult to have this self-governance solution. There are some markets, at least in theory, there is a market solution. I don't know whether there are economists in the room. So then you have the Coase theorem, but that's something very specific. It's interesting, we could have a discussion about that. But it almost never works because of you have enormous transaction costs. So you only have government solutions in these cases. But there are also limits to that. Because a government is a very specific organization. And many of the environmental problems we suffer from today are global problems. Climate change is not only happening in Europe, but it's also happening in other countries. Biodiversity loss, which is a complex problem because it's also a local problem, but it's multiplied and some effects of biodiversity spread around the globe. So these are global problems. And this idea of being global is often referred to in texts. So this is one of the most famous texts in environmental policy, Our Common Future. This is called the Brundtland Report. I don't know whether you have heard about it. So that's the report where the notion sustainable development was coined. It's from that date that we have this notion. And you see, this refers to, it's our future that is common, we share something. It refers to this common good problem. But are these environmental problems really that common? Are they really a shared problem? Of course they are partly shared, but not everything is shared. Because, take for instance the rise of sea level. It's a very different problem for the Netherlands and Switzerland. Switzerland doesn't worry that much about sea level rise. And also income. Sea level rise is something very different from the Netherlands and Bangladesh. The Netherlands don't worry that much about sea level rise. They have the knowledge, the wealth to deal with this type of problems. And the third differentiation is responsibility. We can perhaps take again Bangladesh and the Netherlands. I don't want to blame the Netherlands for everything, but some countries have contributed more, and other countries think they should also contribute more to the solution. Like, that's different with herders on a common land. They share a kind of responsibility. All the cows are creating the same type of problem. So you feel already where this is going. So we saw already that for cost distribution, like global problems, the solution is a state, but we have no global state. And that means that every proposal has to find support from the bottom up. There are common interests with regard to climate change, but we also need to combine this with a kind of sense of justice or other pragmatic solutions. Many of the traditional solutions we have are not working, and you feel that all these climate negotiations are very difficult, and that has several, all these distinctions of differentiation and impact of responsibilities, they play an important role within that. So if you have read the text of Gardiner, his main focus is another problem. So like I said, I try to make you completely depressed. So I give you another problem. So what's also typical about climate change and other environmental problems is that they have so that's also all these things are very new in history. You should be aware of it. So 100, 200 years ago, we did not have this type of problems. They are very, very new for us. So climate change is something really on the long run. Some of the emissions we emit now, they will stay for centuries or even 1,000 years in the atmosphere. If you think about high-level radioactive waste, it is almost impossible to imagine. Some things will stay for millions of years radioactive. And we only have, so if you think about what are the longest human institutions we have, that's probably the church and universities, so that are institutions that already exist 500 or 1,500 years. The nation state is much more recent. We only have a few hundred years nation states. So we need to invent institutions that transcend what we have been able to do so far. Species extinction is a very typical example. Once they're lost, they're forever lost. And also here, so this typical collective action structure reappears on several dimensions. So here we need to find cooperation between generations, so our generation and future generations. It's in the interest of all generations to have a climate policy. That should be clearer. That if all generations would come together in a council and they had to decide, they would all choose for a good climate policy. And if they don't do it, they end up in a very negative situation. But again, there is an incentive. Some might think, if we, just one generation, have business as usual, so that's what Val refers to, that brings more nice things to us, and it will be dealt with in the future. Also, if we have a very strong climate policy, which might cost really a lot of money, and other generations are not doing anything, then this was for nothing. But the thing is with intergenerational issues is that we don't sit together with other generations. We don't have any relation with other generations. There's no, what we say, reciprocity. We cannot punish, so that's important mostly that you introduce punishments. We cannot punish future generations. We are not sure what they will do. They cannot help us. There cannot be cooperation. So it only depends on our choices, but nonetheless the structure of the dilemma remains. So I told you about the prisoner's dilemma, the tragedy of the commons. There are a lot of possible solutions for that. You can communicate, you can introduce punishments, just making sometimes cooperation visible. If you see that other people clean up the beach, then you will also start to clean up the beach, because we are often also fairness oriented. But all these options are not available with regard to intergenerational cooperation. So that means that it's not only difficult in practice, but impossible in principle. That should not be read too strong. It's not from out this, in the scheme is no solution. That doesn't mean that there is no solution, but there's no theoretical solution for that. So that means that we need to worry about other generations, that we need to worry about the future in order to do something. It's not about self-interest, because a collective action problem, like car driving, it's just collectively logical that we do something. If congestion, everyone knows that we have to do something about traffic congestion. We agree that it's just difficult to implement, but here it's more complex. And what Gardiner says, and that's an interesting claim, I think, but we can discuss that, because there are many reasons that climate policy is failing. He says, it seems to be that there are agreements, there are international agreements, but they are always less than we would like to have. And one possible reason for that is that we just think about the impact on our generation. Politicians worry about climate change, but they just think, my vote is the future 20, 30 years, it should be okay. But this climate change is a different type of problem. That's not what we want. There is something else. If you think about future problems, there's something very specific about that. So we know that we should worry about future people, and many of us, I suppose, do, because that's part of giving meaning to life, that we have projects that transcend through time. But we have a problem. This is a very common problem, not only in intergenerational cases. What we call a problem of moral motivation. Sometimes we know what we should do, but we don't do it. This is a very standard problem. You know that you should not lie, but you lie, or you should help someone, and you know that it's better not to pollute the environment, but you do it anyway. And there are several solutions for that. And what sometimes is helpful is that self-interest and altruism, very often they go together. We see them as a conflict, but very often, I get a warm glow if I help someone, for instance. So that makes it easier to behave in a more moral, empathic way. There is something special with regard to future generations. If you see images of people in Africa, you can realize how bad it is. And with some people who are morally sensitive, they think, oh, we should really help, this is really bad, that there is poverty, that people are suffering from hunger. But we don't have an image of future people, and it's more strong than having no image. We really don't know who they are, so that's, you might think that it is a philosophical concern, but it's interesting to think about. They might have technical solutions for climate change. Perhaps not, or probably not, but they might have. We also don't know how they think about cooperation or justice or whatever, how they look like. How will people look like over 1,000 years? So that makes it sometimes more difficult. And so one of the solutions is, theoretically, is we don't think here about all this reciprocity and altruism. We just do now what we think is important. For instance, if you, what I call value-based politics here. For instance, science or art, they all have a kind of intergenerational dimension, and you can do it to give something to future generations, but you also just want that it's important. The intergenerational dimension is just inherent to it. It's because it's intergenerational also that it's important. You want to contribute to science, and that's what philosophers say. You have to contribute to things that transcend your own life, that gives meaning to life. You have children, you contribute to science, to societal solutions, because if you stay in your own life, you cannot give meaning to your life. It's just because referring to something external. So, sorry for this real philosophical sidestep. So what have you seen so far? So I have this typical structure. I just summarize it here. So we have seen that there are problems like the prisoner's dilemma, the tragedy of the commons. We have market state solutions. If it's cost distribution, it's less easy to deal with it, state solutions. We have global cost distribution, so we need to find global corporations. We have problems of intergenerational cost distribution. This becomes already more an ethical affair, and then we have this also the special problem. So I want to add one more problem, because some of you might still be hopeful. So I have to add one more problem. Suppose we have sympathy, strong sense of justice, shared value, and I all believe that many of us have these, so it might not that it be dominant in the political sphere, but many people have these. There is something else that has a similarity to the other structures I thought about. And this is what we call procrastination. What's in Dutch, some might not know the word, so that's uitstelgedrag. Pro is for and kras is tomorrow, and so I put it towards tomorrow. And students are very often familiar with this problem. All people are familiar with it. So suppose you want to write a book or a thesis. That's something you have to do, you know you want to do it, but today there's something else. You want to have a drink with friends, you want to look television, or perhaps you have to do something useful, you have to, whatever, other tasks, you have to help your mother, whatever. And so it doesn't happen. And so what there is the case here, if we describe it more analytically, there is a conflict between global preferences, what I really want that happens in my life, and the preferences I really make, also the preferences I have at this moment. And guess what? It resembles the same structure. But now the other persons are my other selves in the future. So I know it is the best to be writing all the time. If I want a book, if I want to be a famous philosopher with big books, I know what I have to do. I have to be writing. And what I should not do is look television the whole time. Or whatever, playing football, drinking with friends, cleaning my house, doesn't matter. But let's think about what are my incentives. Suppose I know my future self will always be writing. Okay, that's great, because then the book will be there. But then it's perhaps not so bad to look television for one evening. If I know that tomorrow I will have again my strong self will be again present, and also I will plan it in my agenda every evening, I will be writing just one evening, it doesn't matter. But suppose I worry about my future self, this future me, what will he do? He is not strong, he has no strong will, he will be looking television the whole time. So what should I do? Should I write? That's just a waste of this evening, because with writing one day, I will not write a book. So it's bad to look television, but it makes no sense to write. So you see also problems with it, but you see it's the same structure. And I give you one more thought experiment. This is also very typical for philosophy. We make a lot of thought experiments. Suppose you live in a forest and there's only one other person, and whatever. So this is the following thought experiment, which is called the puzzle of the self-torturer. So suppose you are connected to a device, they put a cable to you, and they can give you electroshocks. I suppose that's the meaning of this stuff here. And it has a scale between 0 and 1,000. And you have a button to turn to give you shocks. And the high settings are very painful. It might even be that with 1,000 you die immediately because it's a heavy electroshock. But interestingly, the scale is very refined. It's very fine. So if you put one more, you don't feel the difference. Just one adding, you're not able to feel the difference. So you start with 0. You can try it, so you know what the scale is. And every week, so you have read it already, they offer you the following dilemma. Or you do nothing, or you increase the scale by 1, and I give you 10,000 $. But you're never allowed to retreat. Remember again, you're not able to feel the difference. So what is the puzzle? The person will tend to advance the whole time. And nonetheless, because that's a rational choice to advance, on a certain moment he will be having so much pain that he will be willing to return all the money. And so this is what we often see. For instance, what matters is that the contribution of one step is so small. If you're smoking, you can think just one cigarette will not make the difference. Because that's true, I think. If you, let's for simplicity think that we need 100,000 cigarettes to die from cancer, this one cigarette will not make the difference. You can have one cigarette more, or one evening looking television, or whatever. That will not make the difference. In a sense, that's true. The problem there is that this logic is repeated every time. Every day it is this one single cigarette that doesn't make. So where do we need to stop? Where do we need to boundary? Suppose that I think I should stop at 50, I felt with this scale, and then I have earned $500,000. That sounds like a nice income. But why not stop at 51? It's just a little difference. That's not a big difference. But of course, then it just changes. Why not stop at 52? And the interesting thing here is that a kind of same logic also appears at a collective level. We are a society and they have to decide, should we go 1 year more for full economic growth, or should we start with building a kind of policy that might be a bit costly? What should we do? So I just wrote this example down. But you should not be too worried, because in general life for everything we have solutions. So you should not. For procrastination, everyone should know what the solutions are. You might think, oh no, I am doing this, all this stuff I'm doing myself, I'm procrastinating myself. But we know more or less what you have to do. You have to say very clearly, for instance, in your agenda, between that hour and that hour, I will be writing. I will do nothing else. I switch off the internet, I close my door, whatever. You can put external constraints, like I said, you switch off the internet. You can create incentives. I will reward myself. If I write for 3 hours, I can go to the cinema or have a drink with friends. You can impose dummy goals. So instead of thinking about, I will be happy if I wrote this book of 200 pages, no, just think, if I write 2 pages, that would be great. And then you can reward yourself of just thinking manageable. So there are all kinds. So how do you, if you push the snooze the whole time, what's one of the newest inventions? You have a riding alarm clock. So it goes off and then it drives away. So we cannot put on the snooze. So these are all solutions for our problems. And we can do similar things with regard to collective level. The parliament can come together and they very clearly state to the media, we will do that, because it's important that. However, the problem is that we also, and this is very typical for climate change, is that we also have a kind of second order procrastination, that we procrastinate with regard to formulating solutions, namely the list I mentioned to you. Sometimes we don't do that. This is especially the case if it concerns issues where the costs are high and the solution is vague. If you have to take a really important decision in life, for instance, suppose that your study is not going well, and you're thinking about changing, doing something else or another job, that has a high impact on your life. And you are taking a very big risk. It's also not very clear what you should do. Should you study sociology or medicine, or it's very clear, when should I change? Should I try one more exam period? So the good thing with smoking, while there is something in the logic, there is a clear distinction between stopping and non-stopping. But with many things, there are also gradual changes, like what is the climate change policy? It's something gradual. Okay, so that was more or less the story. I see you're all very happy now. So what is the conclusion of this type of story? Should we think, no, it's really impossible. We are sure that we will end up in an eco-apocalypse, and we see popular cultures very often referring to this idea that there might be a kind of eco-apocalypse. You might know these movies, so it's about climate change, oil, whatever. So, but I think that's a kind of risk of this kind of analysis, that you think it's impossible to do, or more subtle, what Gardiner refers to, but it's perhaps even, I don't know whether it's worse, but many people use it as an excuse. They say, well, it's very difficult, so you should not do, or it's impossible to do. But I think, and now I come to the starting point, the structural analysis reveals the problems in some of our simple solutions. If you say, I just will start taking shorter showers, I have no problem with that. But that's definitely not enough. Your neighbor might be filling a swimming pool. So we need institutions, ways to deal with it. And with other problems, we need other ways to tackle it. You just need to be. So that's, in a sense, you're really challenged with new types of problems. And we need to bring cooperation, so the self-organized, we now need to bring it on a global scale. And the first things are happening, and it should happen quicker than in the past, more innovative. We need things on multi-levels, all things we haven't thought about before. There is an important ethical dimension to it. And so all these problems I mentioned, they require just more complex, not necessarily complex, but different types, new challenging solutions. And I think so this is from a project in my own city where I live. It's very interesting. I think we live in a very interesting time because we have this new type of challenges, and also new, very important things are happening, like the energy transition. I really think this will be an important historical thing, that over 500 years they will talk about the change in energy that happened between 2000 and 2100, that these are really important things. Also, if we have a good climate policy, this might be referred to as one of the new first stages of global cooperation. So I think the problems are difficult, but we live in a challenging time where a lot of things